Hello, my name is Dr. Liliana Corridor. This is a summary of a science-based review on the impacts of hydropower, the social, environmental, economic impacts, and the impact on climate change, because hydropower is not only a driver of climate change, but also a victim of it. I aim this talk as a live submission to the COP26 panel, which will continue working for the COP27 on 2022. And I also aim it at bankers, investors, and manufacturers of the hydropower industry. Now, I am an expert in aquatic ecosystems with 20 years, with studies over a period of 20 years on biology and chemistry, marine biology, channel oceanography, biological oceanography, and a doctorate on freshwater organisms with a view to aquaculture. So I'm speaking on behalf of Scientists for the Mekong, an independent group of scientists, very, very concerned scientists, who are not linked to any organization. We're not an NGO, we're not sponsored by anybody. The idea is to have total independence, so that we can speak the truth, because science is about publication of the truth. And we have found that there's a lot of misinformation, not to say falsehoods, that are being preached by very important organizations around the world. Now, the main driver of the hydropower industry has to be the International Hydropower Association. However, they are backed up by the United Nations Environmental Program, IRP. They're backed up by Alok Sharma, the president of the UNFCCC and current president of the COP26 panel. They're backed up by the International Energy Association, by the International Renewables Association, IRENA. They're backed up by the IPCC. They're backed up by a lot of huge organizations that should be looking after the crisis, the climate crisis that we have, and they are not doing that. Now, we also want to bring to your attention the fact that very large conservation groups, which you would expect paradoxically would be banding, getting together with the other 597 organizations around the world that put submissions to COP26, asking to stop the use of hydropower and stop saying that it was a solution to a climate mitigation as they're preaching. Now, these large organizations, such as the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, which we will refer to as WWF, because we'll be mentioning them a few times, the Nature Conservancy, American Rivers. During the World Hydropower Congress in September 2021, to which I assisted to 21 of the webinars on hydropower, so that I would have from the mouth of the very industry and its experts what was it that they were preaching. At one of the very early webinars called an Uncommon Dialogue, the representatives of WWF, the Water Conservancy, and American Rivers declared, confessed, that they had been in negotiations with the hydropower industry for the past 2.5 years, and they had arrived to a win-win situation in which they could help hydropower become more sustainable, and therefore they're backing them up. Now, this is extremely dangerous, because if you have some of the largest conservation organizations giving their name and their logos and their support to the hydropower industry, they're going against the very principles of conservation. At that Uncommon Dialogue, the CEO of the United States Hydropower Association, Mr. Malcolm Wolf, and I name him by name because of what he said. He claimed that people have to recognize that hydropower as a clean energy with zero carbon emissions, that it's a zero carbon technology, and that it involves river restoration, and therefore hydropower is very important for river restoration. This is the most egregious comment anybody could possibly say.
To start getting people to recognize the benefits that hydropower provides in terms of zero carbon technology, in terms of flexibility to integrate other forms of renewable energy.
And we called them out in the questions and answers, and we said, how can you possibly state and claim that hydropower is a net zero carbon technology when this morning, 4 hours ago, there were 5 representatives of the hydropower industry in another webinar that very clearly admitted that hydropower dams and reservoirs emit greenhouse gas emissions, and they were supposedly giving solutions to greenhouse gas emissions, which they didn't.
Liliana wants to know from Malcolm if zero carbon technology is the right phrase for hydropower when there are some emissions. And apparently there was a discussion this morning at the Congress, the Hydropower Congress, on climate mitigation and reservoir emissions.
So whether it's zero carbon or renewable or what the right word is, I think the better question is to try to get a handle on the science and figure out where are the emissions coming from and what can you do about it. I will note that there's no emissions from hydropower. The emissions are from the reservoirs. And those reservoirs often would exist whether that dam is powered or not powered.
Now, this is important to mention because of the impact that this is having in the decision-making of bankers and investors, because the International Hydropower Association, together with all those organizations we named before, are asking for a doubling of investments for what they call a global deployment of hydropower to help in the transition to sorry, I'm a bit cynic here, but what can I say? They're claiming that they need an enormous investment of $100 billion per year. Let's make that clear. $100 billion a year, when third world countries have been were promised $100 billion a year, and they never got them. They're still short by 20 billion, and they were not getting them until 2024 to do climate mitigation measures. Yet the hydropower industry that produces greenhouse gases is asking for $100 billion a year to create hundreds of new hydropower dams all around the globe. What's interesting is that they pointed out, they showed in the map the areas that they have chosen, they had targeted for this creation of new hydropower dams. And these areas, guess where they are? They claimed that these special areas in the tropics and subtropics were perfect for global hydropower deployment because they looked at the possibilities of the continuation of good precipitation, meaning good rain, that would help ensure that they did not have a problem with water flows. So let me explain something. The hydropower industry requires water flows. Without water, the hydropower plant is not going to produce any energy. And this is one of the biggest issues right now for investors and for bankers, because with climate change we have increased droughts and increased floods. So the areas that they chose happen to be in areas with the highest forest cover: Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, the Amazon, Brazil, Gabon, Congo, and the Mekong River, which is our point of interest. So I'll be referring a lot to the Mekong River because the Mekong River is an extremely important, is the second most biodiverse freshwater ecosystem on Earth, and it has the highest inland fisheries in the planet, on which 65 million people depend on. Now, so what they're asking is to build hundreds of new dams in the areas where we have research, 25 years of research that prove that the amount of greenhouse gases emitted in tropical and subtropical areas is enormous. It is so high in some cases, and that they produce more greenhouse gases, more methane, and we're only talking of methane here, of methane than coal-fired plants. So what's interesting is that a week after I called out on Mr. Malcolm Wolf's egregious comment about net zero carbon technology, within a week it appeared in the website of the International Hydropower Association, a new blog that is called On the Myths and Truths of the Hydropower Industry. And the question was, true or false? Does hydropower emit greenhouse gases? True. Oh, finally. They admitted it publicly. I mean, now it is public. It's been written in lots of documents that don't reach the public, but now they made it really public. Now, however, they falsely contend, that they're extremely rare, those reservoirs that emit greenhouse gases. Excuse me? I have been working on a review of hydropower impacts for the past 10 years. I've been writing a review for 2.5 years, and I'm giving you the shrunk version of that review. There are studies, many studies, there are global studies on global reservoirs of hydropower dams that very clearly explain that there's over, of the ones that they actually could tell, there were over 200 mega dams of the largest dams with the largest reservoirs that had enormous greenhouse gas emissions, and that they could not possibly continue the myth that hydropower is a clean and renewable energy. So let's delete the myth that hydropower is a clean energy. Yet the hydropower industry at COP26, and keeps on doing it at every turn, contends that it is a clean, reliable energy. We'll get to the reliable part in a minute. How is it reliable if the climate change is reducing the water flows, and hundreds of hydropower plants all around the planet in the last couple of years have had to either reduce or stop, literally stop the turbines because of lack of water? Most of them had less than 40% of water storage, and they could not run the turbines at full throttle, meaning that caused enormous economic problems and economic losses to not only to the operators, but to everybody that depended on that energy production, on that electricity, because there were huge blackouts all over the planet, yeah, with enormous economic losses. So I'm saying this to the bankers and the investors: do you really want to invest in an industry that is unreliable and unsustainable? And we'll get more onto that. Another false claim of the hydropower industry is that it is the key to water security. In fact, in one of the webinars, there was a lady called Maria Ubierna, which happens also to be the boss of a hydropower company. And she wrote a book which will be published in 2022, but she showed us the slides of a chapter called Water Security and Climate Change and Hydropower. Okay, they claim in this book that hydropower, the main issue about hydropower is that through the reservoirs, they're ensuring water security. Now, this is totally false. What does water security entail? I define water security for you guys here. It says water security is ensuring fresh water coastal and related ecosystems are protected and improved, that sustainable development and political stability are improved, that every person has access to enough safe water at an affordable cost to lead a healthy and productive life, and that vulnerable populations are protected from the risk of water-related hazards. Under that frame, under those principles, the hydropower industry definitely does not align to the concept of water security. Why? Because, for one thing, with climate warming, there's much less flows. For another thing, because of the hydrological changes that it causes to rivers, the rivers get extremely damaged by hydropower dams, extremely damaged. Wetlands get dried up, floodplains get dried up, forests are lost. So if we're going to talk of greenhouse gas emissions, let us talk about greenhouse gas emissions. There's taboo subjects in relation in the hydropower industry. One of them is deforestation. Did they speak about deforestation during the 21 webinars I assisted to? Only in one occasion, a Norwegian researcher said that greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs, from the vegetation in reservoirs, were negligible and didn't need to be considered. Excuse me? Every study shows and proves that greenhouse gases are emitted because of the decomposition of organic matter of trees, not only trees, but thousands of plants that are part of forests that are drowned, thousands of animals that are drowned, and I mean from insects to all sorts of aquatic beings and all terrestrial beings that were part of the forest that get drowned. They decompose. So one of the things that the hydropower industry said, especially Mr. Wolf, is that it's not the fault of hydropower. Hydropower itself does not produce greenhouse gases. It's the reservoirs. It's like saying, my hand is doing something and I don't have any connection to it. Excuse me? In order for hydropower to work, most hydropower plants have reservoirs. And the problem that we're talking about is of large reservoirs, that emit enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. So those gases are caused through loss of forests. So right now we're talking of climate change and the need to reduce deforestation. COP26 came with a new mandate that by 2030, deforestation will be stopped by most countries, hopefully. That would be the hope, the wish. Okay, so then I replied in Twitter, excellent, bravo. So that means that all your new plan for the global deployment of hydropower is going to be canceled? Because it all implies deforestation. It implies deforestation before the dam is even built, in which all the sides of the river are cleared of vegetation just to put all the offices and to put all the gear that they require for the plant. That's without talking of the enormous deforestation required for lots and lots of transmission lines, energy transmission lines. So that's just for starters in deforestation. Then the second point in deforestation is you have to drown enormous amounts of forests or land that has organic matter in it to create the reservoirs. Okay? Even what they call run-of-river dams have impoundments. And so one of the things we learned at this wonderful World Hydropower Congress is that the time of residence of the water in a reservoir is radically important and directly related to the amount of greenhouse gases it would emit. Okay? Now, they say that on a run-of-river dam, the idea would be to have less than 4 hours of time of residence of the water in the one place. Good luck with that. Then there's a lot of misinformation of people calling run-of-river dams, for example, like the extremely controversial and extremely damaging Belo Monte Dam in the Xingu River in the Amazon basin, one of the most important tributaries. And they claim that it is a run-of-river dam. Even Mr. Atle Harvey in the World Hydropower Congress said, you cannot call a run-of-river dam a dam that has 2 reservoirs that add up to 512 square kilometers. This is just to show the type of misinformation given by the hydropower industry. Oh no, we're good. This is a run-of-river. We're not producing any greenhouse gases. Okay, another thing that came very clearly as a result, a key takeaway of this World Hydropower Congress, was that every single person that spoke, except for Maria Obriema, admitted that the GREST tool, the hydropower industry came up with a tool to supposedly measure greenhouse gases. And they all agreed that the measurements are, number one, unreliable. Second, very few people, very few dam operators and companies do enough of those measurements of greenhouse gases. Third, because I asked, they very clearly said, another person, Sarah Mercier Blay, said very clearly that in the Belo Monte Dam, for example, they do not measure methane emissions. This is in the middle of the Amazon in the tropics. They do not measure methane. Hello. The main problem with decomposition of organic matter is the production of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. The carbon dioxide, CO2, is the very nice greenhouse gas, compared to methane, which has been said to be between 80 and 98% according to different studies, the potency of carbon dioxide. So can you see why carbon dioxide is the nice gas? Now then you have the nitrous oxide, which I asked, does anybody bother to measure nitrous oxide? And they themselves told me, the 2 main authors of the book on water security and climate change and hydropower that is coming out, they themselves admitted that we don't do field measurements of nitrous oxide. And this is of great concern in the Amazon because of very high emissions. Yeah, we only use reservoirs, CO2, and time of residence in the water. Yeah, interesting. Now, nitrous oxide, N2O, happens to be 298 times more potent and more toxic and open holes in the ozone layer like you wouldn't believe it. And it is produced by hydropower dams. So because they apparently didn't know about it or didn't want to know about it because this is a taboo subject and they don't measure it anyway, and they promised that with the new GREST tool, the new advanced version of it, GREST tool 0.3 that is coming out just on time for the COP26, that one would not measure nitrous oxide anyway, but that it was a much better tool. Really? Okay. So one of the things that I did was I put a link to studies on nitrous oxide emitted by hydropower dams. The Chinese did recent studies, 2 studies, on nitrous oxide emissions by hydropower dams, and they found that there's a different process. The methane is created through a methylation process through bacteria in the dam. And there's another one that is the other bacteria that do denitrification. They use the nitrogen and they work it out, and then they emit it through bubbling, through dissolution, and as a degassing agent when the water of the reservoir passes through the dam, through the turbines, there is degassing of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And they found that the higher the temperature of the air and the higher the temperature of the water, the higher the level of nitrous oxide was produced, and this was a serious concern. And this is the Chinese, for God's sake, who are the #1 hydropower leaders and developers in the planet. Okay, so let's make that clear. Okay, so we have the issue of deforestation, and this guy that used one example, which they use in the blog of the Hydropower Association, that says, but see, greenhouse gases by vegetation are not really a problem, because there's one case in French Guiana, in the Sans Souci reservoir, where trees have kept on standing up 30 years later, so much so that they came and they cut them out so that they could use the wood. It happens to be hardwoods, and probably from flooded forests that are used to water. What about the other thousands and thousands of species that were drowned and that decompose in the bottom of the dam, which produce the bubbling of methane, the bubble and the carbon dioxide? What about them? And also the diffusion of methane. What about those? Not a word. What about the fauna that has been drowned? Not a word. Only one case. And they claim that greenhouse gas emissions cannot be allocated to the fact of the decomposition of trees and the loss of trees. Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? And they said that no, that is not the trees. No. It's the soil that produces it. Excuse me. Once the organic matter decomposes, it's going to go to the soil. It's going to be part of the benthos. And that's what produces all these greenhouse gases. So let's stop the falsehood and the misinformation, and let's make this very clear. The decomposition of organic matter creates greenhouse gases, and the emissions are extremely severe. And now they want to create hundreds of new hydropower dams in the tropics and subtropics, where high water temperature and high air temperature will increase and double the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. The IPCC, in its last climate crisis publication, said, oh my God, in the last 20 years, we've had such an increase in methane, and they couldn't quite figure out why. If you have mega dams with mega reservoirs emitting enormous amounts of greenhouse gases and methane, how don't you want an increase in methane? Because what's interesting is that the hydropower industry and all these agencies that have to do with energy, including the United Nations Environmental Program, including the IPCC, have denied the impact of greenhouse gases on the hydropower industry for 3 decades or more. Okay, so much so, and what they do not know is because they also have used studies that have based themselves in a 100-year period of an extrapolation, an invention of what would happen, how many gases would happen in 100 years. Well, there's these studies that I have here that have shown. The latest one is by Oko and his friends from November 2019, in which they studied 1,500 hydropower reservoirs around the project, and they found that that these greenhouse gases, are mostly emitted in the first 20 years since the plant starts operation. Of course, because it's the first 20 years where most of the decomposition of the organic matter is going to happen. Now, another topic that is an absolute taboo for the hydropower industry is methyl mercury. In the methylation process, not only do you get carbon dioxide and methane, but you also get methyl mercury. Mercury is an extremely toxic heavy metal. A researcher, Dr. Fernside in Manaus in Brazil, has written several books on it, and he has done in one of his latest statements and publications, he very clearly states that the problem with methyl mercury is that that mercury is anchored through the phytoplankton and the zooplankton and goes exponentially to a power of times 10 its potency as it goes from plankton, which are those floating little beings that help in the climate change. Actually, they produce oxygen and they are sinks for carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. Those little guys, that little microscopic little beings, are eaten by fish, and those little fish are eaten by bigger fish and by other invertebrates and other aquatic organisms. So the methyl mercury goes through the whole food chain, and the bigger the fishes, the bigger the amount of methyl mercury that they have. And by the time they hit humans that consume that fish, or animals, terrestrial animals, otters, whatever you want, that consume those fish, it's the power of 10 is even further increased. So then you have a problem here, because one of the things that the hydropower industry, especially the Chinese in the Mekong River, said very clearly, why are people complaining about loss of fish? Because one of the hugest impacts of hydropower dams is on fisheries. Another taboo subject. They didn't even have one single webinar on fisheries. And I was expecting that they were going to show us all these new technologies for fish passages and all that they preach they're doing in the planning and the construction of the new dams. Not a single webinar on fisheries. When fisheries have depleted across the world because of hydropower dams, which block the migration of fish for either and other aquatic mammals and animals, they block the passage. So then there is a separation of populations and they eventually collapse. If you cannot migrate to reproduce, it means that there's nobody to keep growing the population and it becomes extinct. Okay? In fact, there was a fantastic lady that I have to praise from the WWF. The only one that really spoke the truth, Mrs. Eva Hernandez Herrera. She works for the European, she was doing a healthy rivers in Europe. And she says that in Europe there has been a 93% loss of migratory fish. So there's not only a loss on, that's a huge loss on biodiversity, and that 40% of European rivers have been altered, okay? And that they have 3,936 hydropower plants. That means nearly 4,000 hydropower plants located in protected areas. Yeah? And so they say that one of the main problems is the loss of fishes. So then you have the Chinese developers in this particular case in the Lower Sesan-2 Dam in Cambodia, who very clearly claimed, why don't people just fish in the reservoirs? There'll be lots of fish that come there and get stuck because those that try to pass through the turbines become fish meal, and the fish passages that they invented did not work. So there's been a collapse of fisheries, a total collapse of fisheries, with already in the space of 3 years extinctions recorded for species of migratory fish. Yeah? Why don't they fish in the reservoir? Excuse me? They're getting the blessings of the Mekong River Commission, which is supposed to encompass and give all the advice for all these countries that share the Mekong River, which is a shared resource by 5 countries, from China to Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam at the bottom in the delta. So they're saying, use the reservoirs and do aquaculture in the reservoirs. When you have, in the lower Mekong, you have tropical and subtropical areas that are extremely hot. And with the temperature increase and of the water temperature increase and the air temperature increase, you have an excess of methyl mercury being produced. Okay? And nobody talks about methyl mercury. Taboo. So I want to bring it out for you investors. Because one of the main problems with the hydropower industry is that it focuses on costs and production of electricity. And Mr. Eddie Rich, the CEO of the hydropower industry, has the audacity to claim, oh, but you're not looking at the benefits. Yes, the hydropower industry has benefits. It creates a lot of electricity that benefits industry. Let's be totally clear about this. Benefits who? Who gets the benefits? The industry. At huge, and every other study lately on the socioeconomic impacts of hydropower will tell you that the costs, the economic costs, the social costs, and the environmental costs of the hydropower industry far outweigh the benefits, and that they should be phased out, that hydropower dams should be phased out. But then you have a case which I found that is very interesting on the creation of the Itaipu Dam, a mega dam that is in the Paraná River between Paraguay and Brazil. Yeah, the surface area of this reservoir is 1,350 square kilometers. Can you imagine that 1,350 square kilometers of forests were drowned, and of the most important waterfall in a World Heritage area, in a protected nature reserve, was blasted and destroyed so that it didn't bother the passage of barges? And the impacts that this has had on 59,000 families were displaced because of human costs. And look what the hydropower industry had to say about this. This is priceless. They said, oh, the displacement of 59,000 families is a mere inconvenience that is outweighed by the benefits. This is what is absolutely outrageous, that there's no regard to the costs in the lives of the people displaced. And there's a lot of new socioeconomic and socio-environmental impacts of hydropower dams studies all over the world right now, many published from January 2021 until November 2021, that clearly state that the costs, the human costs, are enormous. People are displaced. In order to create the reservoir, they drown the villages. And people are forced to move to other places, away from rivers. Often they put them so far away from rivers, they don't know what else to do. These are fishers and farmers, many of whom are not even literate, yeah? And they're transferred somewhere else to these nice little houses that the hydropower dam developers are offering them in compensation. Well, this compensation, there's many people that are still waiting for the houses and they haven't eventuated. They're living in makeshift shelters in substandard conditions with food and water shortages. And those that do get the resettlement villages, and we show here a photo of resettlement villages built on the edge of precipices, of absolute sheer falls of the mountain, in clayish area where all you need is a big flood for the whole village to come tumbling down. And there's other photos we will show you of cracks in the streets, cracks in the mountain area where they put these communities.